All right. Well, good morning and welcome to the Tuesday morning Bible study. We have got good material to look at today in Genesis chapter 13. And so I would encourage you to go ahead and turn to that. We're going to wrap up our discussion of chapter 12 before we start reading in 13. All right. Try to set this up. And then at the end, and I'm going to try to make sure that we have the time to do this. I would like to get your feedback a little bit on our format for Bible study in a few weeks. My plan is to keep on offering Bible study through Zoom, but then also have an in-person option for those who are here in Athens. And of this group whom I am currently speaking, there is a grand total of one who could possibly do that. If Lois were so inclined, she could possibly do that if she wanted to. But she is the only one who could, even if she wanted to. But I was thinking that we would do a hybrid format here in a few weeks, starting in a few weeks. We'd do a hybrid format where we had Zoom and in-person participation, and that way we would maximize the number of people who could participate. So. All right, well, let's get to it. Genesis chapter 13, but I would like to just raise a final question about chapter 12. You'll remember in chapter 12, the latter half of it, we had that wonderful story of Abraham and Sarah going down to Egypt, and Abraham telling a lie to the Pharaoh about who Sarah was. And it was a lie that was aimed at self-preservation. He was trying to protect himself from being killed if Pharaoh sees that his wife sees that his wife is beautiful and wants to take her for himself and then kill him. And so he figures, well, if I tell the Pharaoh that she's my sister, then he won't hurt me. And of course, that's what he does. And then later on, of course, all the police plagues come on to Egypt, and the Pharaoh realizes that he's been deceived, and he says, why did you do this to me? Why did you? And Abraham doesn't explain himself. He just kind of takes it. But then the Pharaoh says, get out of here. Just leave. Take your stuff. Take you and your wife and your stuff and get out of here. And so the question that I want to raise before we look at chapter 13 is, what can we say about Abraham's character so far as he is presented?
He's very human.
Very human.
I mean, he did go when God sent him.
Yeah.
Without questioning much, and but then he turned out not to be a very wise or strong man at this point anyway. So he's just very human.
Yeah. Yeah. Indeed he is. This is, I think, hidden just within that seemingly innocuous statement, he's human, I think is a very important life lesson for all of us. And that is that practically, I mean, maybe there are a few exceptions, but that for the most part, generally, broadly speaking, no one is strictly all good or all bad, and maybe on the whole, some people may seem really, really good and other people may seem really, really bad. On the whole, though, most people are kind of an aggregate of the selfish and the selfless, that we're, that sometimes the good we do comes from less than pure motives, and sometimes the bad we do, from a fair-minded perspective, is more a mistake or a miscalculation than it is actual malice. Uh, and that's, and I just think in a world in which we as a society are divided about so much, it's important to remember that the people that you regard as on the other side are not simply demonic monsters. They are perfectly capable of great humanity and tenderness and kindness. And you the good people are, perfectly capable of cruelty and unkindness and whatnot. So
You mean
we're
those
all
people that
we're all a
I
mixed bag.
argue with on Facebook? Those people are capable of kindness and all that good stuff you're talking about. I need to be reminded about that frequently.
It's a corollary of that. Even Hitler was kind to his dog. That even Hitler loved his dog. And,
Oh,
not
I can remember.
comparing
Yeah,
anyone to
probably are
Hitler,
kind
but
to pets. I can remember that.
the Hitler comparison is too. To compare anyone to Hitler is too much too easy a comparison. But
I think Abraham gives us hope for today, that even though he had his flaws, just like we certainly have our flaws, God can use us in miraculous ways. So that gives us hope, I think, for today.
Right. And the biblical patriarchs in general are good examples of that. They are not whitewashed as these, saintly figures. And that's generally true of the Bible as a whole. Just as it's true of these, these heroes, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their wives. It's also true of the, for example, Jesus's disciples in the New Testament. They're not presented as these flawless figures. They're represented as faltering and mistake prone, and all that. But at the end of the day, their heart is usually in the right place, and that's. And that's, I think that's, that if your heart's in the right place, God can do a lot with you, even if you are screwed up in other ways. So that's important. All right. Well, we're going to see one of the reasons why I wanted to bring that question up, aside from just the fact that that Abraham does not come off well in chapter 12, is that is in contrast, frankly, to how he's going to come off in this chapter, in chapter 13, if you read ahead. Hey, Wendy. Good morning, Wendy. Still connecting to audio. Hello, Wendy.
Hello.
There she is. Hey, how you doing?
I am doing just fine. I've been collecting wood shavings.
Oh, very good. Very good. Okay.
Well, it's not raining.
Yes. Probably not for much longer.
Well,
anyway.
The good news is they're in my car at the moment. So all is good.
Excellent.
So good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
All right. Well, if you have access to a Bible, or if you can do so safely, turn to Genesis chapter 13. And but yeah, in chapter 13, Abraham comes off better. Comes off actually a lot better. And we'll see what I mean by that in a moment. All right, so let's look at 13, and we will read. Let's read at least through verse 7 to start off. All right. So Pharaoh has ordered Abraham and his family to get out. Chapter 13, verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negeb. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver and in gold. He journeyed on by stages from the Negeb as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them living together, for their possessions were so great that they could not live together. And there was strife between the herders of Abram's livestock and the herders of Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land. All right, I'm going to pause there for a moment. What reflections do you have on what we just read, or any observations that you might have?
Well, for one thing, it didn't take long for them to have arguments starting.
Or at least the potential. Yeah, I was going to say, or so far we haven't seen any strife between Abraham and Lot themselves, but their people were having conflict. Yeah, their staff, so to speak, were having conflict with each other. Yeah. No, it did not take long. But yeah, they're both so well off. They both have so much, and the land, it's like the land can only support, so many living things, and so there would be there'd be heads butting over resources and whatnot. What else? You have any thoughts on verse 7, especially the latter half of verse 7? There's a little bit hidden there, hidden in the latter half of verse 7, where it says, at that time the Canaanites and the Perizzites lived in the land.
So the relationship between the Hebrews and the Canaanites have started.
It's one of those things where we make a distinction. What is Abraham experiencing, and what the omniscient narrator knows is going to happen, right? And what the reader knows is going to happen, about the history of Israelites and Canaanites relating to each other, and so there's a certain ominous, from the point of view of the narrator or from the point of view of the reader, there's a certain ominous warning, like, okay, that you and the Canaanites don't get along. Well, here's the beginning of that. Here's the foreshadowing of that. So there's some of that. There's also the fact that here Abraham and Lot are outsiders. I mean, they're from Mesopotamia. They haven't been here before. And here we see this, what could be the beginnings of a conflict between them, when it would be really nice for them to be united when there is the threat of the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Now, of course, there is something kind of ironic about the fact that Abraham and Lot are from Mesopotamia, and they come here, and they are literally acting like they own the place. Okay, there is something mildly ironic about that. But from God's point of view, they do, or at least from the from the God's eye point of view, from the narrator's point of view, from the reader's point of view, that, you know, it's like, we know that's the destiny of their descendants. And so of course they would come in and act like they own the place. But from their point of view, from the character's point of view, you know, none of that subsequent stuff has happened yet from their point of view. And from their point of view, they're foreigners in a land that they haven't lived in before, and they've got people that are not necessarily going to be friendly to them, Canaanites, Perizzites. And isn't it inconvenient now that we are starting to fracture? You know, that we're starting our own conflict when we really ought to be united as people who are outsiders in this what for us is still a foreign land. And so it's like, so yeah, so the narrator is giving us this ominous, a little bit of this ominous threat that there's danger ahead, and Abraham, Lot, you guys need to think about the conflict that you're having with each other, or at least the potential for conflict that you may have with each other. And
The other,
go ahead.
I was just going to say the other thing when you talk about, you know, they go in and they act like they own the place. You know, it's the same old story that those that are tremendously wealthy decided that they own it all.
Mm-hmm.
And this seems to be an ongoing theme throughout many, many stories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That they are the elite.
Uh-huh.
And they are deserving of homage being paid to them.
Okay.
So that they're already sort of losing a little bit of that covenant with God.
Uh-huh.
About living towards God.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. This is, you know, that's an interesting point you raised, because this is going to be a theme that is going to be played out again and again in throughout the Hebrew scriptures. There's going to be something of a conflict between, and the conflict is within the Bible itself. It's not just a conflict with characters, it's a conflict with perspective. A certain ambivalence towards power and riches. Okay. That is to say, there's a sort of a school of thought that's present within the Hebrew scriptures of power and blessing being a gift from God. That if you have power and riches, it is because you have been blessed by God. Okay, so that's one strain. There's also the strain of power and riches corrupting people. And both are true. From the perspective of the Hebrew scriptures as a whole, both strands, both dimensions are present at the same time. That Abraham is wealthy because of God's blessing. I mean, that is what the narrator wants you to right or wrong. I mean, whether that's theologically valid or not, the narrator wants you to understand that Abraham's prosperity is as a result of God blessing. At the same time, it's as though the Bible also recognizes the dangers of prosperity in that. Recognizes the corrupting influence of those things. Later on, this is going to get played out, and it's not going to get played out in Genesis. It's going to get played out in the what scholars will call the Deuteronomic history. That is the history of the kings of Israel, or actually before the kings, through the kings, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. Except it doesn't include Chronicles. The Chronicles are a separate author, but basically, but from Deuteronomy through the end of Second Kings, you have the Deuteronomistic, which is in some ways similar to the Genesis story in that it proposes to tell the story of the nation from the perspective of a later historian who is bringing sources together, traditions together, and whatnot. And within that tradition are multiple voices about whether having a king was a good idea or not, right? And you remember, I mean, you may be familiar with the process by which Israel came to have a king in the first place, and how, at least the way it's presented in First Samuel, is that God's first reaction to the people wanting a king was that this is a terrible idea. This is a really awful idea, and that here you are, you're living in freedom. God has delivered you from slavery in Egypt, and He's brought you to the promised land. And now for a few hundred years, you've been living with God as your king. And yes, God has raised up individual charismatic leaders, to face certain threats to the people, but that that God alone is the king, and yet the people want to be like all the other nations. And so they go to the prophet Samuel and say, we want to be like all the other nations. We want to have a king. And Samuel is very distressed by the request, and he goes to God and he says, what should I tell them? And God says, okay, this is what you're going to tell them. You're going to go and tell them and say, in effect, you want a king? If you want a king, you'll get a king. And here's what you'll also get. You'll get slavery. And, it's like, you want a king? Okay, sure. You can have one. This is what you'll get too. And yet the people insist on it. But then God, it's as though God adapts just a little bit, and God especially favors David. He has very little use for Saul after a short time, but he has a special relationship with David. And yet, even that special relationship with David and his promises to the Davidic family are not guarantees that he will always protect David's royal line when that royal line deviates from the covenant. For more on that theme, I would encourage you to go to the YouTube pages, either my personal one or the church, and check out the For Thine Is the Kingdom series, especially on the Hebrew scriptures, where I basically tell this story. And but just because God is favoring the Davidic power, God is also, through the prophets, a serious critic of the power, the use of power to, oh gosh, hold on. I turned that series somehow. That is a critic of the use of power to violate the covenant, and it recognizes the tendency that power has to do things that are contrary to God's will, which is always about the good of others, about the good of people. And so, long way of saying something very simple. The Bible itself has an ambiguous relationship to power and influence. It's both, on one hand, it's both a blessing from God, and yet it is a dangerous thing too at the same time, and both are true at the same time. All right. So let us do. So with all of that, with this potential strife between Abram and Lot, let's look at what happens next. Let's look at verse 8. And we're going to read from 8 to verse 13. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herders and my herders, for we are kindred. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I will go to the left." And then Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. That's a fascinating little inclusion. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the plain and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. We don't have to go too much into Sodom right now because we're still about 4 chapters away from that. The famous destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't take place for about another 4 chapters. But you get a little bit of narrative foreshadowing of troubles to come with respect to Sodom. Okay. So what do we think? Verses 8 through 13. What are some observations that you have about this part?
Abraham was very accommodating. He gave Lot the choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. This is so interesting because in the previous chapter, he's very calculating. He's trying to save his own skin. And here, it's as though Abraham has been chastened by his experience in Egypt. And so he's like, okay, I'm going to try this trust thing out. God has made a promise to me. I'm going to try to be more trusting. And so, in fact, I'm going to be so trusting, I'm going to give my nephew Lot first choice. First choice of where to go. So this is a very generous, a very trusting and very generous thing for Abraham to do. What else?
Well, Lot was certainly looking at the water resources.
He was.
Making certain that he had a good access to water resources.
Interestingly enough, it doesn't, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the very point you're making, Wendy, is he sees the water resources and it doesn't seem to occur to him to say, "Oh, now I don't want to leave Abraham without water resources."
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
I'm looking at all of it. I'm looking at which half is better. And this half is really better. So see you later, Abraham. I'm going to take the better part, which both underscores Abraham's trust and his generosity in this, and Lot's self-seeking, or at least not thinking so much about how his choice impacts Abraham. Yeah. Good.
But we know that Lot, we are told that Lot chose to go pitch his tents near Sodom. And we are told that Sodom, the people there are wicked. It's kind of like a forewarning from the writer that there is trouble on the horizon because Lot made this choice, I think.
Exactly.
And interestingly, that while Lot is being selfish, one might consider mildly wicked, that he ends up choosing that direction to live.
Mm-hmm.
That there's a certain amount of, I find it interesting that he chooses the direction that is going to lead to destruction. Out of, I'm going to get the most for me. Well, he certainly chose the right side for that.
Right.
Would Lot have known that the people that where he was headed were like that
Not
at that time?
Yeah, not necessarily. I mean, it possibly, but not necessarily. From the, certainly this is, I think that the main way this is function, this language of, Sodom was very wicked. This is less what Lot might or might not know, and more the narrator giving us a little fair warning. Watch out for this because something's about to happen. The narrator is giving us some fair warning of something that's about to come down. But yeah, Lot is very self-seeking here. He doesn't really stop to ask what's left for Abraham. Few other things that are interesting too. Take a look at verse 10. Speaking of like narrators' clues that the narrator plants. Look at verse 10. And this is part of Lot's deliberation. Lot's thinking about it so that he makes the choice that he does. Verse 10, Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar.
Are those supposed to be two phrases for the same place, or are these two separate places?
Two separate places. Garden of
separate
the Lord,
places.
Garden of the Lord, and then the land of Egypt. Two separate
Okay.
places. Yeah.
So what would he mean by the garden of the Lord, like the Garden of Eden?
When he says that.
Would that be the Garden of Eden he's talking about?
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
Yeah.
He was never there. How does he know?
Well, yeah, that's fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. But
Well,
the narrator,
stories would start
narrator knows about it though. But the narrator tells us that Lot looked at everything, and that it says, the narrator tells us that Lot made that jump, looks at it and compares it to the garden of the Lord, to the land of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously well-watered places. This is another example. More narrators foreshadowing. Except in this case, it's a little backwards. It's both backwards and forwards in the narrator's mind. I mean, just stop and think about it. Lot is choosing what he's choosing for practicality. He's thinking practically speaking, having a great sources of water is good for me. So I'm inclined that way. And then he compares this land that is so well watered, to the garden of the Lord, or to Egypt.
Well, he's thinking he's pretty deserving.
Say again.
It sounds like he considers himself pretty deserving of the best.
Okay. He certainly seems he does seem kind of entitled, doesn't he? Of course, Abraham gives him the blank check, in essence, to do that in a way, but yeah. Now, here's what I'm talking about: the narrative foreshadowing and backwards looking. Think for a moment. Lot makes this comparison between what he's about to take on, makes the comparison between that land and the garden of the Lord, Garden of Eden, and the land of Egypt. How did the garden of the Lord work out?
Kicked out.
They were kicked out. Oh, the garden of the Lord was great as long as they were there, and then they were kicked out, right? Let's consider the land of Egypt for a second. Now, the land of Egypt, this is what I'm talking about. Backwards looking. Again, this is why it's important. I think it's important to think about everything we're looking at, to think about it from two perspectives. From the character perspective, how is the character experiencing these things? Okay, in real time, so to speak. But then also to look at it from the narrator's point of view, from the omniscient narrator, the narrator who knows what's going to happen. Because the narrator will put little clues in the text sometimes to foreshadow things that are coming, as we've seen with, these little mentions of Sodom. The narrator knows that in 5 chapters, he's going to be talking about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So there's that. But there's also, in addition to foreshadowing of what's to come, there's also looking back. And Lot looks back and he compares what he's seeing to the garden of the Lord. And he's focusing on how wonderful the garden of the Lord is. What he's not remembering is the garden of the Lord. Wonderful as it was and is a place that is shut off from human beings forever, or at least from as far as they are concerned, shut off from human beings forever by divine command. And so the garden of the Lord didn't really work out very well. It was a great place to live while you could, but it's been shut off. Land of Egypt now, as far as they're concerned, land of Egypt both is a little bit of backward looking and forward looking. Backward looking in the sense that they've already had an experience with Egypt. Egypt is very abundant. It's also a place where Pharaoh takes your wife, and the covenant can't be fulfilled if Pharaoh takes your wife. Okay. But then, of course, there's also the forward-looking, the foreshadowing of what's to come, that Egypt in itself is going to represent, in time, is going to represent the great enemy, the great oppressive power that stands in the way of God fulfilling God's promises to and for a free people. Okay, so it's like just in this little comparison, this little seemingly harmless comparison of this wonderfully well-watered land to the Garden of Eden and to Egypt, it's like the narrator wants you to know that Lot is doomed. Lot's choice makes all the sense in the world from the point of view of practicality, right? It makes all the sense in the world from the point of view of practicality. And it is absolutely the wrong choice. That is absolutely.
You keep talking about how he's looked back at the Garden of Eden and of Egypt. And so he's also brought up the fact that Lot likes to look back, which shows up a little later.
Yes, I knew somebody had to say that. Yes. Or at least somebody related to Lot anyway. Maybe not Lot himself, but exactly. Oh yeah.
But looking backwards is not always perhaps the best choice.
Not always, no. And consider, if Abraham had done too much looking back, he would never have gone to the promised land. He would never have gone to this land that God was promising him. And but the thing, again, the thing that we want to really see here is that Lot's choice made all the sense in the world from the level of on a level of practicality, made all the sense in the world, and yet it was the wrong choice. And the narrator, is planting that thought in our heads even now with the business about, oh, and by the way, Sodom was in this land, and and this was all before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah and stuff like that. That it turns out to be the wrong choice, all made possible both by Lot's his own self-seeking, and by Abraham's trusting generosity. All of this was made possible. This sequence of events was set into play precisely by these things. Oh yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. Let's see. I'm just looking ahead here a little bit. Yeah, Sodom, the story of Sodom and Lot's involvement and all that's going to happen in chapters 18 and 19. And needless to say, there's going to be a lot of interesting discussion to be had around those chapters. All right, let's look at, let's go through the end of the chapter. Let's go through wow, man, we're going to finish a chapter today. Goodness.
Oh, well, let's see what we can do about that.
Yeah, right. Wendy, I expect you to play your part. Okay.
Glad to help.
Yeah, there we go. All right, well, let's start at verse 14 then. We'll read through the end and then we'll discuss. Okay. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, raise your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, and eastward, and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Rise up, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Okay.
So are we to assume, had Lot chosen the other land and Abram had ended up closer to Sodom and all of this kind of stuff, would the Lord still have said, I will give you all this land? Do you think God had a choice in this? We aren't told that he did at all. Just like he will make do with whichever way Abraham goes.
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Well, and I think the answer is we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know. We don't know how that would have been handled. I mean, a couple of clues. I mean, we know certainly that that God is not a puppet master in all of this. God is not pulling the strings and literally controlling every choice, every action. And yet God is, and so God is working with what is being dealt.
The other thing that's a little different is there's no mention that Lot decided to build an altar to God.
Right.
That so that Abraham was really making an effort to keep God in the picture.
Right.
It's a little less certain whether or not whether Lot was.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Right. Now it is in Lot in a little bit of Lot's defense, a little bit of Lot's defense, I would say that God's covenant is not with Lot. There's no point in the text where God comes to Lot and says, you know, Lot, I'm going to make a covenant with you and your descendants are going to be like the dust of the, you know, he doesn't say that to Lot.
Yeah, but he certainly had to have been exposed to God
Yeah, definitely,
and
definitely was.
God's, that he was being the beneficiary of the covenant made with Abraham.
Yes, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Now, what is something I said last week I think is important to recall here too. Lot, I remember last week I said that that for all the years, at least of adult life, those years where Lot and Sarah persisted in childlessness, and Lot being Abraham's nephew, that Lot was the presumptive heir to Abraham's property. Okay. He could not carry on Abraham's name, but he could certainly be an heir to his property. And as long as Abraham and Sarah remained without sons, then Lot would be the presumptive heir to that property. But just as Ishmael, according to the Hebrew scriptures and to the narrators, from the narrator's point of view, just as Ishmael is a false answer, a false fulfillment of the promise that God makes to Abraham and Sarah, so Lot is a dead end also. Lot is not a fulfillment, is not a fulfillment of the promise that God made. And it is as though from the moment, at least from God's point of view and from the narrator's point of view, that the moment God makes that promise to Abraham, it is Lot's destiny to be disinherited. or not so much disinherited, but to not stand in the line of, to not be in any line of promise. And we know that. Lot may not know that. Maybe he does know that. Maybe that's why he's looking out for himself and he's trying to get the best land, you know, is that maybe he knows that if God actually does come through and fulfill the promise that God makes, then, you know, he won't stand to get anything from Abraham. And so he needs to do the best he can with the fortune that he has, and build it up as much as he can on his own. That actually is a good explanation for his you know, somewhat selfish outlook on things. But point is that we know that Lot is a dead end as far as the promise goes. And God doesn't say anything quite like what he just says to Abraham. He doesn't say anything like that until Lot leaves the scene. Lot has made a choice. He leaves. And now that he and God are alone, God, you know, just says, look around. This is yours. Your descendants are going to have this land. This is going to be your people, your descendants' lands forever. Now this is anticipating the future expansion of Israel, from the point of view of the later narrator. If you would hold your place in Genesis and turn to the book of First Kings. First Kings. Into First Kings chapter 4. Chapter 4. Okay. And look down at verse 20. We're going to start at verse 20. Okay. And remember what I said, that First Kings is part of a series of books, basically from Deuteronomy all the way through the end of Second Kings, that was written by the so-called Deuteronomistic historian. It may have been one person, or it may have been a school of people, okay? But they were writing in like the 5th century BC, and they were writing the national epic. Just in many ways, just as a redactor who put the book of Genesis together was telling the story of the nation. In many ways, it's a very similar project. It was not done by the same people. It was not done by the same people, at least apparently not done by the same people. But it's the same kind of project. It's trying to bring together the diverse sources of the past to understand what God's relationship with the people has been over time to bring them to their present state. And the people who wrote Deuteronomy through Second Kings were living at about the same time, or close to the same time, that the person who put all the pieces of Genesis together were living. And so they had, in a way, an interesting, similar perspective on the events of Israel's history and how God had been active in all of it. And so that's the narrator's point of view. The narrator knows that long after Abraham, that under King Solomon, that these promises would sort of come to their ultimate fulfillment in the kingdom of Solomon. So look at First Kings chapter 4, beginning at verse 20. The heading in my Bible says, "The Magnificence of Solomon's Rule." Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea, ate and drank and were happy. Solomon was sovereign over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines, even to the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. Solomon's provision for one day was 30 cores of choice flour and 60 cores of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region west of the Euphrates, from Tiphsah to Gaza, over all the kings west of the Euphrates, and he had peace on all sides. We'll stop there. This was Israel at its height. This is about the same time that this was written. Genesis was being put together, and the story of Abraham was being told. And so the promise that is made to Abraham is sort of in the mind of the people who wrote this and imagined a time well after Abraham in which these promises would come to a kind of glorious fulfillment. Now, going back to that point, though, that I made earlier, which I think is very important, is that the Bible is not a single voice. It's multiple voices, often coexisting. It's like the Bible in some ways is best understood not as a single voice, but as a conversation, as like the record of a conversation. And the Bible, then, being a community of conversation, can both celebrate Solomon's kingdom and at the same time, critique Solomon. critique Solomon and critique his successors. That with the fulfillment, with all the success and all of that, came in effect a regime that much more resembled Egypt than it did God's vision for a covenant community. Okay. And both voices are present in the witness. So that in a way, it's like if you think of God as like the father of Solomon, Solomon is his child. It's as though God is both proud of Solomon and at the same time wants to come down on Solomon, proud of what he's accomplished, and yet at the same time is critical of the way that power and that influence gets used. So yeah, so that's good. All right. Now I know it's 11:33, so we are nearing the end. I thought that by doing what we would do in chapter 13, that we would probably go the hour. Before we knock off today, let me just share with you chapter 14. I'm not going to read it. Actually, I would invite you to read it on your own, not only for next week's purposes, but also to read especially verses 1 through 12 and pray that no pastor or worship leader ever asks you to read this in church. It is absolutely a freaking nightmare of names and places. Wendy, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this to you one day. Do not cross me.
Ooh, now there's a challenge.
Just kidding. Yeah, I mean, it's just unreal. If you look at chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, it is just a nightmare of names and places that, oh gosh. I mean, it scares me, and I took Hebrew. It scares me off. I'm intimidated by it. All right. So yeah, I invite you to read ahead in chapter 14. We're going to see an interesting event that happens in Lot's story after he has departed the scene and he's gone into the plain. What happens to him once he gets there, and prior to the whole business with Sodom. So that'll be an interesting thing next week. Any other comments or thoughts on the chapter today?
I just have to say that you are totally amazing, Tom, because I've never had a director of biblical study who can find so much in these little chapter, these little verses and things that ordinarily we kind of skip through, reading them quickly and waiting for the next drama to occur or whatever the big story is. But there's so much in there, and never in all of my 167 years have I ever had anyone who can point all that out. It just makes me think, I should have read this Bible from cover to cover years ago. Not that I ever would have gotten through it, but
Yeah.
But thank you so much.
You're most welcome. It's a great pleasure to unveil these things, and it's true. My passion for it is driven by the fact that there is so much there, and that it's worth it. It's worth it to find it out. If it were purely just intellectual candy, that might be fun, but it's much more than intellectual candy or theological candy. It's stuff. It's really good stuff to chew on, and maybe even what's more, it helps us to more fully appreciate what is going to happen in the New Testament. It gives us a greater foundation for what's going to happen in the New Testament. And yeah, just one final thing along those lines. I was going to say that I had a ball this past Sunday. We were teaching I'm doing a confirmation class for our young people. We have 4 kids in the class. Holly, you would know, Holly and Wendy would know the Vaith kids, Teddy and Valerie, and then Daniel Norris and Monica Graham. And so the 4 of them are in the class. And but we were talking about prayer, teaching prayer, and I was teaching them about the Lord's Prayer. And I did some of you have, I've heard my Lord's Prayer TED Talk before, and just how the Lord's Prayer is a wonderful example of a script. Of course, it's based in Matthew and Luke, a text that is repeated, in personal devotions or in church. It's repeated by rote, so often that we say it automatically and we don't think at all about what we're actually saying. And what we are actually saying is loaded with significance. It is absolutely loaded with scriptural antecedents, with stuff that when Jesus taught the prayer, stuff that Jesus was thinking about, scriptures he was thinking of when he said, pray this way. There's so much there. But yeah, no, Lois, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that. All right. Well, let's close with prayer, and I have not received an update on Karen's daughter Hillary, but I know that we prayed for Karen's daughter last week, and we will continue to do so this week. All right. So let's pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for another opportunity to gather in this forum in this way, to study these wonderful scriptures in the book of Genesis. We thank you for the opportunity to dig deep and to take a moment and to notice the depths of meaning and significance that are underneath words and verses that perhaps we've been familiar with for a long time. But we thank you for the opportunity to dig deeper and to discover the riches that are there. Lord, we do pray for all who are in need, all who are facing any challenge or trouble right now. We especially lift up to you Karen's daughter, Hillary, and pray for her and pray for Karen, that your Holy Spirit be strongly present in their lives, bringing healing and hope to them. I pray for each person within the sound of my voice, whether at this moment or in later viewings of this video. Pray for all people who are in need of your special healing touch right now. We pray all these things now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Well, good.
Thank you.
No, you are most welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. And as I say, we're gonna keep on going with Zoom. So don't worry about losing Tuesday Bible study. We'll keep doing Zoom. But yeah, in a few weeks we may, for those who are here in Athens, we may also have a live audience. And what I may do, I'm looking into options, but what we may do is actually get a camera that is external to my computer, so that rather than using my computer camera, my laptop camera that shows me like this, that it would be an external camera that could get in its view not just me, but like a group of people, right? That could be focused on a group of us. And then if you're joining by Zoom, you could see all of us and we could see you. And so it would be like like nothing had changed. Maybe the only thing that would change is that rather than seeing me up close, you might see me from back here, but that would be the only difference. So,
Gotta go, Tom. Bye.
okay, bye-bye. All of you have a wonderful day and stay safe. I know the weather is supposed to get a little nasty later. At least here in Georgia, anyway.
right.
I don't know about you, but maybe Iowa is perfectly fine right now.
It's
but-
good right now.
Good.
Mhm.
Okay. Well, y'all have a good one.
You
Thank
too.
you as well.
You.
Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Tom.
Thank you.